Today, watch this.
Under international law, the Western countries in particular say they're committed to free trade, but you sometimes get the impression that only Australia seems to really observe that commitment, even to dropping our traditional quarantines.
Well, I didn't put it on because you were coming in. I was just doing some research, but that's the OECD agricultural policies in OECD countries. It's a publication that comes out each year, and it gives you the current subsidy tariff rates. It's referred to as total support estimates, and I think it's a fair call to say it averages about 41%. Australia averages between 4 and 6%. Well, if you think your farmers are 34% better than the farmers overseas, we'll have an agricultural reality in Australia. But if you don't think we're 36% better, then we're doomed. And there is not the slightest doubt in my mind that agriculture in Australia is doomed. Within 3 years, we'll be a net importer of food. I mean, you can use a different definition. It could be as much as 7 years. But whether it's 3 years or 7 years, you live in a country and there's just no way we can survive against, you know, the OECD countries, where there is a 36% advantage they have through their subsidy tariff regime. And that's publication for all the world to see, produced by the OECD countries. It's not my figures. But today we found out, Narelle, what did we find out today?
Holden can't get their utes into America.
Yeah, Holden utes hit with a 30 or 40% tariff into the United States. We had some legislation in Parliament the week before last, but the Jones Act came up. But if you have a boat going from one port in America to another port in America, then it must be built, and a boat built in America by law. It must be manned by exclusively American crew, and it must be owned by Americans exclusively. So, I mean, India provides 23,000 million in subsidies to their farmers for fertiliser, just for fertiliser. Well, our total agricultural production is only about 27,000 million. $23,000 million subsidy. Brazil cross-subsidises. I mean, they don't cross-subsidise, but the effect of their ethanol regime is a cross-subsidy of about 4,000 million a year. Well, our total sugar industry is only $1,500 million a year. Their subsidy, cross-subsidy, is 4,000 million a year. So no other country on earth is free trading, except Australia and New Zealand.
Governments of both persuasions seem to not have sufficient regard to the interests of farming in Australia.
Well, I mean, it is just extraordinary to me that the governments would persist. I mean, if I was to go back, I mean, a lot of my speeches were, you know, pro-free trade. I think there needed to be some loosening up. But I never, ever remotely thought we're going to go to the extent that we've gone to. Never in the wildest stretch of my imagination did I think that would happen. But it has happened, and Australia now cannot produce a tyre. Australia cannot produce an electric motor. There's hardly any boat building left in Australia of significance. And our motor vehicles are down to, I think the last figure was 12.7%. When Keating started on this free trade thing in 1984, we had 82% of the cars in Australia were Australian made. But on the present graphs, within 10 years, we'll not be making cars in Australia. So within 3 years, you'll be a net importer of food. Within 10 years, you'll be not making any motor cars. You are already not making any electric motors or tyres.
As I understand it, it was said by our competitors that the quarantine was really a method of protection. Is that so?
Whether that was true or whether it wasn't, the fact of the matter is that Australia was not an agricultural country. 200 years ago, we had no husbandry of animals, and we had no cultivation. We're the only country on earth, and we're an island. So we don't have any diseases. I mean, every other country, New Guinea, you know, they cultivate it and they husband animals. We Australians 200 years ago didn't either. So we don't have any of these diseases. And if we want to stay clean and green, then we have a right to prevent these products from coming in Australia. But when the chief of, deputy chief of the Department of Biosecurity was in North Queensland, there was a forum on, and I asked the question, have you rejected any application? And they talked among themselves, then they rang Canberra twice, and, but they were unable to name a single application that had been rejected. So in other words, you make an application, you'll know you'll get into Australia. Might take a few years. There might be a few constraints initially, but you know you can get into Australia. Everything can come into Australia. I represent about half Australian mangoes. The Americans will not let our mangoes in. There's a little bug in the seed, some of our seeds, and that's it. All over Red Rover, you can't get any mangoes in. But yet, they are bringing apples in from countries that have fire blight, endemic fire blight. They are bringing prawns in from countries that have endemic white spot and IHHNV. And we said, you bring them in and we will get IHHNV on our reef, on our Great Barrier Reef. Well, we've got IHHNV on our Great Barrier Reef now, exactly as we told them. So there is no restraints on bringing anything into Australia. But you try and send some of these things into other countries. No way, Jose, no way.
Why are our authorities so open to disease-prone produce?
They have this in their heads that they, marketism, you know, free markets. I mean, I have never ever ascribed to a theory that we're out there in trade to be fair, you know, and do the right thing. You know, we're out there to win. I mean, unapologetically, you know, it is a brutal game, international trade. And we'll play it by the rules, the same rules everybody else plays by. 41% subsidy. And we'll play by those rules. But I mean, China's got a set exchange rate, Professor. I mean, they're not playing by any rules, they set exchange rate. I mean, America and the European countries have got their interest rates down at 1% to bring their dollar down. Whereas our governments just run rampant. I mean, our interest rate's 5%, the dollar's going through the roof. And of course, tourism's gone, agriculture's gone, manufacturing's gone. I mean, there's just carnage everywhere. But to give you the most outrageous example of all, I'm the only country on earth that subsidises imports, has to be Australia. And as Sherry Harvey said, you know, if you buy this fridge through the email from overseas, you do not have to pay GST and the other administrative charges. But if you buy it off an Australian, then you have to pay GST. Well, I mean, that will give you some idea of how ridiculous this fanaticism is. And, you know, I mean, people were blinded by communism for nearly 70 or 80 years in Europe and Asia, when people were blinded by fascism, you know, in Europe. People were blinded by laissez-faire capitalism last century. Well, we're blinded by marketism in Australia. We're fanatical, obsessive regime. I can't explain how anyone could be so stupid as to believe in communism. I can't explain how anyone could be so stupid as to believe in laissez-faire capitalism. I honestly have no idea how people could be so stupid as to involve marketism when you know nobody else is doing it, Professor.
The newspapers, the serious newspapers would be strongly committed to the free market, would they not? The economists who write for them, for example, in the Financial Review and so on.
Well, you know, as you would be aware, I have a history book which, you know, is on bestseller lists for 2 or 3 months there. I don't know if it still is. But in that history book, there is a very significant section on the Depression. But every single newspaper in this country told us that Otto Niemeyer was right and that Theodore was wrong. Well, we all know now that, you know, Takahashi, Japan didn't have a depression. John Maynard Keynes in Great Britain didn't really have a depression. Germany had a terrible depression, but they brought Sharked in and then they had no depression. America, late in the depression, the New Deal economists, Eccles and head of the Federal Reserve, and John Kenneth Galbraith is a very young man, you know, New Deal economists came in and they worked their way out of the depression. But we were still in the depression when we went into the war, because every single newspaper in this country believed that we should restrict money supply, because this is a depression, we've got to tighten our belt. That's what Otto Niemeyer, well, to quote the great Winston Churchill, the worst mistake I ever made in my life, it's come from a man who dreamed up Gallipoli, was to listen to the advice of Montague Norman and Otto Niemeyer. Well, we listened to Otto Niemeyer and we got it completely wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. And, you know, if we're doing it again, well, we did it in the 30s.
What did Theodore want to do?
He wanted to expand money supply. I mean, I could explain that a lot of ways. But, you know, I mean, Takahashi released bonds. The bonds were paid for by the central government, which in other words, he just printed money. Shark didn't muck around, he just printed money. John Maynard Keynes had the government borrow a lot of money and spend a lot of money, which amounts to the same thing. And the New Deal economists borrowed a lot of money, spent a lot of money. And that's the way they worked their way out of the Depression. And but Theodore was ahead of the game. And you know, was a very clever man. Of course, he ended up one of the richest men in Australia when he left politics. He and Clyde Packer were great friends, very close friends and associates, and they formed the Consolidated Press. But I mean, everyone in the world went down the pathway of expanding money supply, except Australia. And all the newspapers and all the commentators, not one of them, I don't think there's a single, you know, anyone that backed Theodore and Curtin and Chifley. I mean, they were much younger men, but they backed Theodore. In fact, all of them lost their seats in Parliament that election.